Morning, Benji.
Good evening, Alex. How you doing?
Not bad. I'm nearly done with the implementation, I think.
Oh,
I ended up doing what you suggested. I gave I'm calling it semantic optional. I produced a new wrapper type and then I have to redo execution for some stuff.
okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think that was going to be easier than passing a flag through every single layer of GraphQL.
Yes. This is why I was hesitant to push ahead with it until there was, a concrete implementation, because yeah, I imagined it was going to involve a few more changes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're making progress. That's very promising.
Yep. Yep. Couple more execution tests that I have left to get passing.
Hi everyone.
Morning.
Hey, Martin, how you doing?
Good, good. It's been night actually for like almost 3 hours now. It feels weird.
Yeah. Okay. I think we're just waiting on Lee, but I'm sure he won't mind if we get started a little earlier. Jeff will be joining us slightly into the meeting. So let's get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the November GraphQL Spec Working Group. By being here, we've all agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, links to all of which can be found in the agenda. We'll start with a quick round of introductions, starting with myself. Hello, everyone. My name is Benji.
Everyone, my name is Martin. I think Greg, you're next.
Hello, friends.
Hi, Lee. We've just kicked off introductions.
Oh, beautiful.
Greg?
Hey,
Hi,
Rob
next.
here.
Are we doing it in the order of the attendee list?
Ideally, yes.
Okay.
I think it is you now, Koi.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. I'm Koi.
Hi, I'm Benoit from Apollo.
I'm Alex. I'm here as an independent.
I'm Greg.
Jeff's going to be late.
With Wayfair.
So I guess that's me. I'm Yakov, also here as an individual contributor.
Hi, I'm Steven.
Calvin.
to the top, Lee Byron. Here representing myself. Hey, folks. All right. Just in case Benji did not already mention it, of course, we all agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, contribution guide, and code of conduct. Let's take a quick look over our agenda. We got a bunch of stuff to look through. We did not end up hosting secondary meetings, I don't believe. So there's nothing to update from those. And all right, main meat to get into today, making reason non-nullable and deprecated, discussing enhancing our deprecation overall, incremental delivery updates, nullability working group update, the directive meta field proposal, subscriptions and source event stream errors, and then interface field argument default values. Planning to keep us busy, but is there anything not on our agenda that anybody wants to make sure we have time to talk about today?
I would like to mention a couple of things. One is that I don't think the secondary working group meetings have gone ahead for quite a while now. So maybe we should cancel them for a little while until we need them again. We at least have the tooling in place to add them very easily if we do turn out to need them. And secondly, we also don't seem to be leveraging action items so much. People seem to be self-organizing mostly. So I'd also like to propose that in streamlining things, we also potentially remove that from our agenda structure.
Both resonate with me. Anybody disagree or have anything else to add? We'll take silence as alignment. Cool, let's make that so. Yeah, we can ditch action items, at least from our agenda. We may want to leave the mechanics there just to track things in GitHub if we want. And we can cancel December and ongoing secondaries, and we'll just sort of, disable the tooling to do that. But we always have the mechanism to bring it back in the future if we want to.
Sounds good. I'll take care of those.
Awesome. Thank you, Benji. All right, let's jump into the thick of it. Martine, we have you up next with non-nullability reasons.
I need to unmute. And hello, everyone. I love a good nullability discussion. And kudos to Alex for taking the topic a bit later in this meeting. So as a warm-up, I'm suggesting we talk about deprecation and the reason of deprecation, which is today, actually, if I go here to the pull request and to the change files, today the reason of a deprecation is nullable. I'm guessing, but some people in this meeting might have more context here, but it comes from a long time ago. I don't know, maybe there was no default argument or something like this. And it looks like most of the tools, at least GraphQL JS and Apollo Kotlin, both of these tools, they do represent the deprecation reason as just a non-null. I mean, internally, it's either you have a deprecation reason or you have no deprecation reason, and it's not deprecated. So the only way thing this allows today is to do stuff like add deprecated reason null, which doesn't make a lot of sense. So the suggestion is to make everything the reason required, which is technically a breaking change, but I believe it's for the better. So yeah, I guess this is all I've got. Any thoughts on that?
Lee, if you're talking, you're muted.
Thank you. I was just saying I was scrolling through our introspection to see if this is like an existing conflict in there, or if maybe there are also other plays to change this. You can
To
let
add
me
a
know if
little
you've already done
more,
that research.
to add a little more context to this, I think Jordan raised a pull request, which was to GraphQL JS, where if you specified at deprecated reason null, and then you printed the schema back out, the deprecated would go away, which I guess makes sense because there's no reason. So, but it meant that the is deprecated, I think, was true, but the deprecation reason was null. So when you tried to output it, it just didn't come out or something like that. He has raised a pull request to rectify that so that if you feed in with a null, it comes back out again with a null. Nonetheless, I think this is a bug in the spec. I think it's a long-standing bug in the spec, and we should just add the bang. I think it's breaking, but anything that it does break probably shouldn't have been working in the first place. So I think it's probably okay.
Okay, I'm looking through the spec and it is consistently optional in many places. So we will need to update a lot of more places than just this one. One area to go look through is the introspection schema and introspection documentation overall. Both has deprecation reason as an optional, just like a regular string type. And also as it describes it, it says optionally provides a reason why this field or argument is deprecated. And all these places. So that's cited in, I don't know, half a dozen or so spots. There's also a couple of places throughout the spec where we show examples using the deprecated directive, and we show it without showing a reason.
But that's fine because it has a default, right? So it's still optional, even though it's non-nullable.
Oh, right. I see. Yeah. So if you do not provide the reason, then the default value applies.
No longer supported.
I wonder if the deprecated reason should not be optional then.
Yeah, I think the reason is optional, but the value should be non-nullable because it has a default. The default makes it optional, but it should never be set to null explicitly because at the moment it's both nullable and optional.
Correct. Making it non-nullable, but we do declare in the spec what the default value is seems super reasonable. So I'm certainly in favor of this one. So I guess the question is, should we do this one in isolation, or should we also, or is this other one sort of like a follow-up change? Because if you find deprecation reason, you'll see that it optionally provides reasons. But if the deprecation directive has a fallback reason, then this shouldn't be optional. Like it should always provide you some string, a non-nullable string, because either it's the one that you provided or it's the default one. It shouldn't be possible to end up with the null value, right?
Just to make sure I'm following up, we are talking about introspection and deprecation reason in field. It's currently nullable, but because if field is non-deprecated, well, there's nothing we can put in there, right? So I guess if we want to make this more type safe, the question is maybe do we want to remove is deprecated, but that feels like a much bigger change. Yeah.
Oh, if I remember correctly, there's some slightly strange code in there that checks if the deprecation reason is the default one, then it might return null. I can go double check, but anyhow, maybe it's all the better reason to treat these as separate changes.
I have a feeling that there is tooling that checks just one of the properties in the introspection and not the other. I think relay, but I can't remember which one it is that it references.
Hopefully is deprecated, because that's the only one that definitively tells you if it's deprecated or not. Anyhow, we don't have to like synchronously block on me searching
Yeah,
through
yeah.
to see the lineage of this. I'm in support of this change, especially since it's got a very clear fallback value. I think it makes sense. Fixes the bug. Cool. Any other concerns? Otherwise, we'll call this one a quick accept. Excellent. All right. Thank you, Martin. We'll move on. Let's talk about enhancing deprecation.
Yeah, so I spun up an issue in the GraphQL spec. I know in the past we've made small incremental changes to deprecation. I kind of threw a how can we make it all better issue out there, and hope we could talk about next steps. If it's a good idea, if the points I'm raising are valid, and how we would want to see that work broken up into reasonable, of course, chunks of work, because it's kind of a huge issue. But I really wanted to have the conversation more globally, because I think I was trying to raise connected points, and it's a bit of an interconnected conversation. Then of course the work could and should be incrementally delivered, of course. So I'll go ahead and share this. All right. So I kind of broke it into two major points. One, there are client-side deprecation gaps. So we're talking about when clients want to understand schema. And then there's also a service deprecation use case, where when we're trying to work collaboratively on developing schema, there's deprecation that information that could be useful in coordinating that work. And so the broad strokes are client-side deprecation. The gaps are that there are object appearances that can happen that we don't currently cover. So for example, when using an interface, you can have a fragment on an interface name or a type, or on a type name. You can also have it on union members. So two examples there. And so there's no good way to communicate to the client, this fragment needs to go away and is invalid. You can, of course, deprecate a field, but you might not want to actually deprecate the field. You might not want to be changing that. You might want to be communicating, I want to take this type away from from a union, or I might want to stop implementing on an interface on a type. And so those are the two client use cases I called out. And so I think we could maybe stop there and talk about that first, if that sounds good to folks. If we agree that those are gaps or not.
I think these are all gaps. Conceptually, anything in the schema should be able to be deprecated. And I think the only reason why some of them aren't is because we started with what we've got, and we've incrementally moved from there. And not everything has had deprecation support along the way. And there's, of course, always idiosyncratic behavior around what it means for a particular thing in input or output positions to be deprecated, which is why Benji's good advice at the bottom of this issue to kind of slice this one language feature at a time will be helpful, because it'll allow you to kind of think through what are all the, like, if this is in a deprecated state, what if it doesn't come back in the schema, what things can break, what are the validation rules that need to be aware of this, and kind of like manage through all those cases. And then we can chunk by chunk work our way through expanding deprecation out. But I don't know, hopefully it's not too controversial a statement to say every single thing in the schema should have eventually have the ability to be deprecated. Curious what others
I'm
think.
down for that. I'm down for that.
I have a comment. This is not directly kind of related to deprecation, but I'm we basically there is going to be a backward compatibility risk, right? If it is a member of a union. Should we make a note of that? Okay, so
To deprecate it. So I guess
not
the path I would
not mark it as deprecated. I think there's a problem if you actually delete it.
Yeah, so the goal here is to start to create the language to communicate to clients to migrate away from the use of that thing. And so in this example where I've got a e-reader implementing a printed media interface, and I have this inline fragment, the goal would be to communicate to the client to stop doing this so that the client would remove it, which would remove the incompatibility of removing the printed media interface from e-reader. And so it's about pushing the client to make a change so that it's not a breaking change to remove the interface. Right now, there's no vehicle to say, client, stop using this inline fragment so that I can take away this interface implementation.
Yeah.
And so that's the goal. So it's actually, the goal here is to address your concern.
Well, the problem with backward compatibility is because those code are already shipped. If you think about mobile client, there's no way to update those code, right? So I guess maybe my suggestion is kind of maybe make a note about that, right? The like newer code going forward, they will like stop using the interface the type, but your shipped client, you can't change that code. It's already shipped, and it will break.
But that shipped code should eventually be replaced by new shipped code
After
version upgrades. And so you should be then tracking the usage of
yes
like this
like
to me this unlocks like a whole new
it
unlocks a whole new opportunity to
yes
incrementally track change and evolve your schema.
This is aligned with how deprecation is used today, right? Like if you deprecate a field, and QA resonate very well with what you're saying, because once you ship like a mobile binary, like yes, you want to replace it, but once that binary is out in the world, like it can be difficult to.
It's actually
Yeah, it takes for yeah, unless you're like hitting the kill switch on that build or something, it can take a long time. But to that point, like if a historical build sends your field called get the thing, and you want to deprecate the field called get the thing, all your existing code will still be calling that field, which means your server can't delete it. If it deleted it, all of a sudden that historical query would just instantly start breaking. That is a breaking change. But if you deprecate it, then that's a signal to clients that you should not be querying that field anymore. Future queries should not include it at all. And in fact, if you get a version of introspection with deprecated elements not included, you won't even see it there. And so that mechanism exists. I think the same would be true for union member types or interfaces to say, hey, this type in the union, the server promises to never return one of these ever again. So it is safe to never select over it, but appreciate that if I delete it from my schema entirely, your existing query will break. So I've deprecated it to let you know that this type will never return. But it is a good point that like you certainly wouldn't want to deprecate something and then also have the server then return data of that type. And so that might actually be an interesting case that we would want to account for. Because obviously with a field, if you don't select it, it just never occurs. The server can't give you back a field that you didn't ask for. So that's fine. But if you say, this union member is deprecated, and then the server returns back a value of that type, then a compliant client which has heeded your deprecation warning and gotten rid of that and doesn't include it in their schema, their client side will break because now they're receiving an object that they don't know what it is. So that might be an interesting case that we'd have to make clear note of. But anyway, all the more reason why kind of going through this kind of language feature by language feature will help you unpack all of the ramifications of what it means to kind of state transition from it exists in the schema to it exists in a deprecated state. What are all the things that might break, and make sure that they're all accounted for.
Awesome.
Oh yeah, we can't have an empty union. A union must be able to return something. Yep. Yeah, so there's
So
probably a validation rule that's like a union, at least one member of a union is to not be deprecated. So there's yeah, all kinds of like fun things you'll encounter when trying to make sure that that's added in a safe way.
And this is why we're saying do it on a feature by feature basis, because every single one of these has huge amounts of complexities.
Yeah, not to
So-
scare you away from it. I think this is an exciting set of changes, but eating the elephant one bite at a time.
yeah. Okay. So do we want to then? So I agree with that. So obviously, like easy slicing, talking about unions and interfaces separately.
Mhm.
Good. So the service deprecation use case is a little bit different. It's more about telling people to stop utilizing something that exists within the graph. So for like scalar, for example, stop returning scalars that you want to go away. Objects, kind of same deal. Stop returning an object, stop contributing to an object through like extension, for example. And kind of so on and so forth, right? Same with interface. Don't implement it, and also don't return it, and also don't extend it. Um, uh, Inputs, unions, enums, pretty much everything. And so would we, assuming everybody agrees that this makes sense, like the service collaborative use case also makes sense, which I feel pretty strongly it should. Would we want to slice these individually, or do we see if there's a commonality among them that they should be grouped in any way? I'm good either way.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, these are different because rather than the audience for this being the schema consumers, the clients that are writing the queries, the audience for these is in fact the schema designers, other people that are operating within the schema and adding types and fields.
More so, yes. I would expect, IDE tooling to consume an introspection query result and then give you crossed out things where like your normal kind of deprecated doc block annotation might do. And there might be use cases on the client side that I haven't considered for some of these too, to communicate to the client, stop doing X, Y, or Z. But for most of these, like for the scalar, it's not really going to, there's not a lot of client value to deprecate a scalar, but there's a great deal of service collaborative work value to saying stop creating fields that return this scalar.
So I think that it should be a different directive because I'm not sure that necessarily I'm going to use, I've suggested in the chat, discontinued just off the top of my head. If you say something is discontinued, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's deprecated for a client to request it. There may not be like a newer way to do that yet, but you're just saying don't add more usages of it effectively on the server side. So I think expressing that this is for a different audience by using a different directive, I think would be wise. That doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't show up in introspection and things like that. It absolutely can. Yeah, just I think it might make sense to delineate it a little bit.
Can you help me understand that? Why separate directive? I think I would immediately be confused if I saw two synonymous directives to understand when I was supposed to use one versus the other.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think of a situation where you might say, Well, it's interesting because these things would generally apply to different types. Like a scalar, it doesn't make sense from a client's point of view for a scalar to be deprecated. Like it's not going to change anything, right? We have rules in the deprecation set, which say effectively if something's deprecated, then all of the ways to get to that thing should also be deprecated. So if you deprecate a scalar, that means by extension that you're deprecating every field that that uses or that returns that, also every input field that uses it, every argument that uses it. And that may not necessarily be your intent. You may still be happy with people issuing queries to all of these existing things. You just don't want them to be used in any future fields for some reason. Maybe it's like int versus big int because now your database has gone past a certain size or something like that. I don't know. I haven't thought about it deeply yet.
I
Yeah,
agree that this is like a semantic thing. Oh, sorry, like go on.
Oh, go ahead.
No, like the semantics of it. Yeah, I think we should pull on that thread a lot more because I could see like on a client side, if you're going to extend schema, like do some local schema extensions or things like that, if you're trying to extend a pattern, you don't know whether it's, schema designers are actually looking to trim usage of that. I could see that being kind of like the signal for client developers and consumers of the graph to make note of something like that. But it wouldn't, like you said, like as you say, Benji, it wouldn't necessarily be that, right? It could just be something that you want to abstract away and not expose to introspection or something like that.
But
So
there's
yeah,
client-side extensions that you could add, right? Or like
yeah,
or even in the sense of when you're, doing composite schemas in various ways, you can sort of like lift the type of one thing into the schema of another thing or cross-reference. And we want to be careful. So the mechanism here that I actually really like, so coming back to the idea of a scalar, like what would it mean to deprecate a scalar? My sense is that the simplest possible thing is it means you can exclusively reference a deprecated scalar in a deprecated position. Like you cannot have a non-deprecated field return a scalar that has been deprecated itself, or you can't have an input argument to something except a scalar type unless that input argument itself has been deprecated. And as long as that is true, then like that gives you the guarantee that you want. You can literally have a schema validation rule that says, like, hey, server-side developer, you assembled a schema which is not valid because you put a deprecated thing in a non-deprecated position. And then that information is shared between the server environment and any extending environment, whether that's a client or a composite schema situation, that like, hey, this scalar called, the old way to do integers still exists, but you're only allowed to use it in a deprecated position because we plan to get rid of it. So that makes sense to me.
When we talk about the object deprecation, that that same type of validation, I think would make sense there, where you can only call a deprecated object from a deprecated field, but that would be in conflict with this usage of the like I intend to deprecate this object, so don't extend it anymore. And so I agree that with that, if we want a way to signify that, it's got to be something else.
I guess that was my root question is, what is the value of having a logical difference between intend to deprecate and deprecate? Or is that even what we're trying to get at here? We lost the thread.
I have something we should consider here. These things are most useful to clients when we can have an equivalent in the IDE for them to use, right? Having to go and read notes on a schema that something is discontinued is a little more difficult. But if your IDE can raise it for you, which is what there's an equivalent to deprecation today, like how do we take the discontinued to make it useful to clients that they should maybe stop using something? Like what is the parallel there?
So I'm not sure if the intent of this is that we should be stopping the clients from using this. I think the intent is that when you're writing like SDL, for example, that describes extensions to your schema, you shouldn't be then using that. So the autocomplete that comes out when you type in a field and you're asking for an argument, you don't get an autocomplete in that has, for example, small int. You would only get big int in that list, for example. That's my understanding of the intent. Does that align, Greg, with what you were intending there?
Yeah. The intent is, I mean, I think there are likely use cases on the client side. Scalar is a good example where there aren't, but object types that can appear within the schema itself are examples of where it might, like again, interface being one of them, type names, object types being another one. But the intent was largely to be able to create a language to say, stop contributing, stop using this thing. It is to go away. There's not a good, we deal with at Wayfair, we deal with a large number of subgraphs. We've got over 150, and we've got types that are coordinating across dozens of them at a time. And so being able to communicate this thing's intent, like we intend for this to go away, we intend to replace it with this, start using that or contributing to that, stop people from contributing to things. That's the intent.
Okay,
And
so
if
there's
we-
like two parts to this then. Benji, I'm trying to understand what you were saying better earlier. So you're saying like the schema designers then wouldn't create new fields with this type. They would instead begin to deprecate the old fields that use this type, and then that leads downwind to the client. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, essentially that, yes. I think if you, for example, wanted to deprecate a scalar, that would be a huge piece of work, right, across all of your subgraphs and everything else that you've got going on, because it would need to be consistent on the client that every access point to that was deprecated. That's a huge piece of work. But you don't want this problem to get worse. You don't want that huge piece of work you're going to have to do at some point to get worse. So you start by marking it as discontinued, like do not use this in any new places. And then you start pecking away at those by deprecating this field because it's got a replacement, deprecating that field. You've deprecated this input argument because you've replaced it with an additional alternative input argument that you can use, and so on. And you can then address it over months rather than trying to do it as one huge piece of work. And again, if you deprecate a scalar, that is kind of meaningless to the client. Like you can put a scalar in a query, right, by having it as a variable type. But the important thing there is if we say that deprecation must pass through all the things, then technically the field where you used that scalar would already be deprecated itself. So you already have that information. We're not really adding anything extra for the client there. The audience for this is very much the server, the schema designers, I think.
I now much better understand, Benji, what you're getting at of the difference here. That makes sense to me. It also makes me think that this might not want to go into the spec if this is not communicating an observable change in behavior between a client and the server. Then perhaps this is like purely the domain of tooling to help server environments manage their changes over time, and less about like identifying unique information within a schema. Because if this is unique information within a schema, that means it also needs to manifest to the introspection API so that you can maintain the sort of duality between what the introspection says is true and then therefore how to represent that in the schema language. And the primary mechanism of deprecation is a filter function. It is to say, right now, the way that it exists in introspection is a little bit odd, but the intent of deprecation in introspection is to say, you can either get only the subset of a schema, which is known to not be deprecated, or you can get all of it, which includes the things that are deprecated. And both the superset and the non-deprecated subset should be valid schemas themselves. But that's like the whole intent is to create this sort of subsetting And if you get the whole thing, then you at least know the differences because we give you the is it deprecated or not and what's the reason metadata so that you can get the whole thing. And then your tools can later build that subset themselves if they want to be more sophisticated. And so if the intent of this is to not actually deprecate something, but provide like additional metadata to say, by the way, we in the future would like to deprecate this, so stop using it in new fields, and we're going to slowly start deprecating old fields that use it. That feels less useful in the spec and introspection, and probably more useful in like a specific server's migration tooling. Does that track? Does that make sense?
Slight counterpoint to that. I agree with you in general, but the slight counterpoint to that is, for example, if you're dealing with a lot of subgraphs, you are introspecting those and then representing them in other places. So it is useful for that kind of tooling. And we should, even if it's not in the spec proper, there should be a spec that covers this, a metadata spec, for example, that outlines common metadata keywords, because we want tools like graphical, or maybe not graphical, but like the GraphQL LSP, when you're running that in VS Code, to be able to know that this thing is, again, discontinued, for want of a better word, when you're writing SDL out by hand or that kind of thing.
Yeah, that was going to be my kind of counterpoint as well, particularly now that the GraphQL spec's embarking on this, well, essentially the official version of Federation. It's embarking into this space of collaborative cross-service graphs. And so communicating the state of the graph between those services, it actually shifts services into contributors and consumers of the graph. They kind of enter into a slightly different space, particularly as you're digging into, so they stop just occupying a single monograph contributing schema, and they kind of enter into this new contract with how the graph operates. And so being able to communicate the state of the schemas that exist this in a distributed manner, I think, is important. I don't know that I'm arguing that it has to be part of the core spec. I don't know if the plan is to have a distributed spec. It could live there. It could be a recommendation. I think it would be helpful to be consistent, though, because I could see different methodologies emerging, and then different tools will do it differently, and then that could create its own set of problems.
Okay, there's some great guidance happening in the chat, which is I think there are 3 paths that you could go to explore to move this forward. One of which is to kind of narrowly define this in the terms of deprecation. It's like more things should be able to be deprecated. There's hard and fast rules for how that should work. There are various elements of the schema which don't support it at all yet that probably should. I think that is genuinely valuable work, but it may or may not hit your motivating case. And then Jeff and Benji both have great suggestions here in the chat. One of which is there's a long-standing proposal that has had very kind of slow work on it, but I think is very valuable, which is the concept of this sort of like general introspection directives that would allow custom tooling to introduce rich metadata into the schema. So I think that's quite compelling because it allows a richer prototyping tool, and one where we don't have to force something into the spec in order to get early tooling to align. And then Jeff has a slightly hackier solution, which I always like the hacky approach first, which is we have comment blocks or descriptions. And we could use descriptions for things as, you could imagine some special thing that you look for in that says like, maybe you need a date there. The other thing that I have in mind is like, you want some tooth to this. And what is that tooth? I think we need some iteration there of like if something is not quite deprecated, but it's discontinued, what is the tooth that will stop someone from adding the next field that uses it and says, actually, this is a warning, your build will fail or whatever. it would be quite interesting to see tooling start to get built that explores that space to find out what's the right balance between good developer experience, but also to support this kind of migratory work. And then what data was necessary in the schema in order to make that happen. And descriptions it's a bit of a hacky approach, but it can be a great experimentation ground to say, I put this special line of text in my description, and then that lights up my custom tool, and I'm iterating on my custom tool to feel what works. And then we learn, here's actually the data that we need.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's an argument to be made that for that sort of deprecation, the more server side, I'm using deprecation for lack of a better term. Great points were made, of course. Maybe the standard, maybe instead it could be standardizing on the doc block style. I mean, syntax for describing the state of the more server side programmatic aspect of things.
I think that's a great way to
they've
do
served
tool
great
prototyping.
cross language for a long time.
That's definitely true. I think the using the description and some special syntax in the description is great for I say prototyping, but even large scale. Like if you were saying, I'm going to build a fairly robust thing and it's only going to work within my one organization, totally viable path. I would say we should stop short of like codifying and specifying that in the spec itself, in favor of this issue 300, which is the mechanism for adding metadata into schemas, because that truly then gives you like a richer way to add that data in. That probably is one step better. That of course is more work. I think there's still a lot of value from getting that full change through. So that would be another thing to start to explore, of like, oh, if I were to build out that mechanism internally and we started building tools on top of that, does that get us what we want?
Okay, I'll give this all some more thought, and I'll start trying to break it up into separate minor conversations. And I'll show up again soon.
Awesome. Thank you for writing up the super detailed issue and proposal and guiding this conversation. As you can tell, this is a rich area of improvement and a decent amount of complexity, and I'm fired up to see progress. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
All right,
Appreciate it.
We'll move on to Rob. A little update on incremental delivery. Rob, take us away.
Yeah. So I'm going to share my screen. Hold on. Okay. Yeah. So we have this spec PR open for a little while now. It is on the larger side, some tedious changes in here. So I was hoping, and as a reminder, this is implemented in GraphQL JS 17 alpha, has been for a while. So I made a integration branch with a subset of the changes, basically just picked out the exact changes of section 3 and 7. This is section 3 is the directive definition. I hope that's not too controversial. And section 7 is the description of the response format. So the idea being that we can focus on like one area at a time and month by month move on until we get through the whole thing. While it looks like there are a lot of changes here, there's a few examples which add a lot to it. And that's another thing that I'm not totally sure about, not sure how heavy you want to go on examples. Do we need more? Do we need less? Should we move them to an appendix? Open to suggestions like that. I have some references here of this discussion thread from a while back that basically has like a whole list of examples and example queries and responses. So this might be helpful to review while you're looking at this PR. And yeah, basically just want to start getting eyes on this stuff. And and also open to is this the right way to go about it? Maybe we can check in next month and see if this was helpful. Yeah.
This is awesome progress. It's making me feel like you remember our old compliance acceptance tests framework? This idea's popped up every once in a while again. Man, it would be awesome to have something like that for this as like a way to essentially as like a codified version of that appendix, right? It's like here's a whole bunch of examples, but they're examples listed in a form that allows you to execute them. And then see, you know, given this query, you get this sequence of responses. So anyway, I'm a big fan of the idea of an appendix, because I appreciate that this is a massive change. It's a humongous amount of work. There are a decent amount of edge cases to be cautious of, and having the sort of balance between legibility and readability in the spec. Like the spec can be technically correct, right? Like it's covered every case, but then we know that it's easy to misread it, misinterpret it, or miss like the combination of some of those cases. Means like examples will be extremely valuable. And I know we don't really have a lot of precedent for an appendix that gives you a ton of examples, but in lieu of having something like a compliance acceptance test framework, I do think an appendix full of like edge and corner cases to be cautious of could be super valuable. I really like that idea.
Okay, yeah. So this PR, I have the like I said, the directives defined with their arguments and stuff. That's section 3. There's quite a bit of changes to just describing the response format, and then at the end of this, I have like 2 examples, and for each response, each like payload, I like go through like why it did what it did. So I can move those to an appendix, and but yeah, if we could start getting feedback on all of this, that would be really helpful. Yeah, that's pretty much it for me. Just want to get eyes on this.
Awesome. I've been kind of scanning through it as you've been talking, and I'm liking what I'm seeing so far. There's a lot of really excellent detailed work here. I will give it a more thorough read through and some comments along the way. But thanks for this update. This is super cool work.
Yeah, awesome.
And of course, everybody else is also invited and welcome to provide feedback, not just me. So go read Rob's PRs in full, provide some feedback. All right, let's talk about nullability.
Hello, hello, hello. Yes, some updates from the nullability working group. We ran a poll and we have at least temporary honed in on some specific syntax that we want to use. Yeah, I don't know. I can talk more about what we picked, but it's a question mark for optionals. It's nothing for semantic nullability, semantically non-nullable, and exclamation point for non-null. I have a implementation nearly done. I'm trying to get a few more tests passing. We also have a pair of blog posts that I think I want to tweak a little bit more before they go out. But I'm linking those in the chat. Benji has done one that's very detailed and will be good for people who are developing clients, people at Apollo, Relay, etc. And I've done one for end users of those smart clients. So just the things that they need to know, very stripped back, very simplified. Once the implementation is done, I'm going to be working on the spec edits to go along with that. But yeah, I think we're pretty well aligned on the details here at this point.
Very exciting. Do you want to give us any of the backstory of arriving at the syntax? I know that's been a great debate. Help us through the progress that's been made there. How'd you get to the decision point you're at?
For sure. Yeah, we ran a poll. There were three options. One was nothing, bang, and double bang. People felt that was escalating danger. And that one got the least votes. There was the one that we went with, question mark, nothing, bang. I think that one is a little more probably better for future users. It reads a little bit more like a lot of the modern languages, how they deal with nullability, sort of quote unquote nullable by default. And then the third option was introducing a new piece of syntax for semantically non-null. That one would not have required a document directive because it is purely an additive change. So it's a little more fine-grained evolution of existing services. And people decided, I suppose, that they were more interested in making future GraphQL cleaner than they were in making evolution simpler. We're open to changing this again if we release it and the users decide it sucks. But honestly, the doing the implementation, I don't think swapping will be too difficult. But it's easier to talk about this if we have something locked in, at least for now.
Cool. Yeah, I think staking a claim on what you think the right thing should be is the right plan. That way we can get something fully built, we can get a full spec right up. Myself have been on both sides of the fence of make it incrementally adoptable versus the document level directive. Both have their benefits and trade-offs. So I don't feel super strongly about one versus the other since I've been a flip-flopper myself. It's just more important that we end up settling on one and make some forward progress. So it's super exciting update.
Cool. Yeah, I myself flipped. It was a tough choice. Benji, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is a little bit interesting about using this currently proposed syntax is what it means for people writing GraphQL queries. Do they stick with the old syntax because all you really care about with GraphQL queries is exactly all you ever cared about? Like, it doesn't actually change. Semantic nullability doesn't change anything about the way that you write a query, or doesn't need to. So then we'd be proposing that the unadorned type would mean nullable when you write a query, and would mean it would mean semantically non-nullable when you write a schema, which might be a little bit strange. Or do we try and shift the entire ecosystem over to the new syntax, introduce this directive both in, because it's a document directive, right? It can be both in executable documents and in type system documents. And if we do that, what does that mean for queries? Because queries tend to only care about nullable and strictly non-nullable, which are the two extremes that we have. So in which case, a query that the client writes now would have to have either question marks or bangs and never the unadorned type, unless we introduce a rule that effectively means that that's more subtle. And so there's still, I think, a lot to be explored with that particular syntax. Brackets, not a fan.
Brackets not a fan. Yeah, I would feel more strongly about a document level directive for an executable document than a type system document. I have a hunch that some number of order of magnitudes more executable documents get written than type system documents. And so the cost of changing those significantly higher. And especially since there are basically exist no exclamation or question marks there today, with the small exception of variable types. Then being very quite cautious about how we introduce them in other places to make sure that it aligns with the new version of the world seems like the right thing to do. Awesome. Do either of you need any other input from this group, or any sense of what we should expect next from this work stream?
I think we are going to release a blog post that's sort of an update from the working group. And then I guess once the implementation and spec PRs are out, then we'll be looking for reviews on those. And then once those are locked in, we're hoping to move to the next stage, I think.
Syntax aside, we'd love to get people testing all of the different functionality of what's being proposed here. The Relo folks have already done an awesome job of introducing their new, I want to say, catch directive. And we also have a lot of work where, for example, I think one of the Apollo toolings has the semantic nullability directive, which is, of course, independent of syntax. And I think there are various other places that have adopted that as well. So it would be great to get people actually using this whole new concept of semantic nullability and really seeing whether it does actually solve the problem that we set out to solve like 4 years ago or whenever it was, which was at the time client-controlled nullability, but is now more a better, more accurate understanding of when a null is a null versus when a null is an error, which is what we think is now the important thing. So yeah, really, we'd love to get some users of all that stuff, I think.
We've also been
Excellent.
working on a handful of related, and by we, I mean mostly Benji, has been working on a handful of related utilities. I don't know, do you want to talk about, what is it, toe and sock?
Yeah, sock and toe. Yeah. So yeah, I wrote a couple of small utilities. One of them was effectively to take a schema that supports. Back up a second. The way that I see it with the new system that we're proposing, your client will either run things in like the new mode or the old mode. So in the new mode, there's no null bubbling. So everything that was strictly non-null becomes semantically non-null. Semantically non-null just means it should never be null unless an error occurs, which effectively allows us to add bang in more places. So the whole reason for this syntax that we are introducing, these 3 different things, the question mark, the unadorned, and the bang, or the asterisk and the bang, whatever. The whole point of this is actually effectively what we're doing is we've got 2 schemas. We've got a schema that's intended for null bubbling and a schema that's intended for no null bubbling. And we've kind of smushed them together and tried to make it easy for someone to write that schema without having to write it twice. But a client will effectively only ever deal with one version of that. So what SOC does is it will take that larger schema that defines everything, and it will then choose how to output it as one of those other 2 forms of schema, which you can then feed into, for example, GraphQL code gen. without GraphQL CodeGen needing to have any changes. So you just say like, oh, this is all non-nullable. And it's up to you to know that that non-nullable means, but it might still error. And how you make that the case is either use something like relay with its throw directive, or you use GraphQL tow, throw on error, TOE, tow. Throw on error is incredibly trivial. It's like 100 lines of JavaScript or something like that. I'm not even sure it's that much. But essentially what it does is it takes the data and the errors, and it says, if you see an entry in errors that has a path, then when you read from that path in the data, the act of actually accessing that property should throw an error. So literally, it takes the throwing that was happening on your server side that then got serialized into data and turns it back into throwing on the client side, which then means you can use your try catch or your React error boundary or whatever error handling mechanism that you have in order to try this. So what this means is if you use both of these things, you can actually start experimenting with the full stuff with all of your existing tooling. It will work with like Apollo client or just with a fetch based thing. If you use relay, that's got its own way of handling things. So use that. But like everything else, Urkel and everything, you can use this throw an error. And you can use the sock when you feed it into CodeGen, and it will then choose whether to express something as non-nullable or not. So again, more tools to play with so that you can experience all this new stuff today.
Cool. Yep. I think that's about our update. Yeah, we'll come to the next working group meeting with some more stuff.
Incredible. Thank you both. Super excited for the progress. Let's see, what do we got next? Oh, directive metafield proposal. Yakov, take us away.
Sure. And just want to echo that is some really, really cool stuff. This is, I think the title of my item over here may sound like this is a very large proposal, but it is not. I should have had 2 underscores in front of directive. Let me put into the chat what exactly I'm proposing if you haven't yet seen the pull request. So this is not a large change at all. This is just to add 1 additional meta field. Meta fields are how we access introspection. I think they're just for introspection, and we have 3 of them, right? We have the schema meta field, and we have or 3 main ones on the that you can access as root fields. We have the schema meta field from which you can access everything about a schema, or you can pick currently, you can pick the type, and you can access information about a particular type. But you can't actually, I should say there are 2, and I'm proposing the 3rd. You can't actually yet access an individual directive by name. You can get all the directives on a schema by using a subfield and the schema meta field, but you can't get a particular one. So this change is a small change just to enable that behavior. Like let's say you want to specifically know whether your server supports defer or supports stream. Now you can do it without getting that, potentially, although probably not incredibly lengthy, but potentially lengthy list of directives and through the schema field. So it's a small kind of filling out some functionality, and basically to make the type and directive meta fields, completely parallel. It's not, again, not specifically, considering we don't have so many directives, I'm not sure that it's 100% necessary. You can always get all the directives and filter for whether the name, defer and stream are within that list. But it just seems like a nice bit of nice to have functionality. So I made the spec proposal, which is linked in the agenda, and the implementation as well for people to enjoy thinking about. And that's basically, again, I think it's like for sort of a little bit from the sublime to the very nuts and bolts kind of turn in the discussion.
I love a change where if you literally just read the spec change line by line, you would spend less time than if you described described it. It's like, those are beautiful changes. You know, it's like the motivation for this is nuanced and specific, and then the change is like one small thing. I love this. I agree that there's this gap. We should have it. Can I add in one spicy idea? You guys tell me if I'm making this more than it should be. I have a sense that adding the type, double underscore type field was actually a miss. We should have instead had a type with a name parameter as a field on the schema type itself. So you do double underscore schema to get the schema object, and then you do type with name, and then that gives you the specific type. In which case there would be two different ways to get to types in the schema. You can do types and get all of them, or you can do type name and you can get a single one. But both of them would be properties of the schema object itself. So I feel like in hindsight, I wish I had built it that way. And if that's something that resonates with everybody, then one of the things we could consider is doing that change, deprecating the top level double underscore type in favor of the of a type field that is on the schema object itself. And in doing so, also add a directive of name. Anyway, that's my spicy idea because it blows up the scope of your proposed change. But I was curious to see if that resonated with people, or if anyone thought that was a bad idea.
And would be the advantage over the way you have it, putting aside the addition to directive, the advantage to that proposal for just type would be that schema would be the only introspecting directive, and that you find per se appealing, or is that the basic pro?
There'd be okay. So the primary pro is that one, that you would narrow down the set of double underscore fields to exactly two. There's type name, which you can use inline anywhere in the query, and then there's the double underscore schema, which you can get at the very top level to get this entire schema object. The other is that I think it gives us a single place to do more complicated behavior on schemas, which we've kind of shied around for a long time, as opposed to sort of like adding all of those as incrementally more top level fields. And so another example of a thing that I was thinking about this as we were talking about the deprecation topic earlier, there are many fields within schema where you have to supply an argument to include deprecation or not, which again, I feel like was a miss. It made sense when there was only one thing that was deprecated, and those were fields. Then there was sort of only one place where you would put that. And then slowly, as we've added more things that can be deprecated, we've added more places where that exists. And again, in hindsight, I wish that I had a single argument at the top level as you get schema, which gives you either the deprecated schema or the schema which includes deprecated things, or the schema which does not. And either way, you will get a full schema that is valid. And then you will not need to know that you need to include this above and below. Because otherwise it is actually, I think right now you can't necessarily get into a broken state, but certainly if we start adding more the ability to deprecate more kinds of things, if you ever supplied include deprecated false for some things, or just left it absent for some things and true for others, you could absolutely get a broken schema. You could get something where you ask for the exclude the deprecated types, but include the deprecated fields, and now you have a field that refers to a type that you didn't fetch, and your client code will break. So as those aren't the end of the world, they're done by developer tools. Developers will very quickly realize their mistake and they'll fix it. But it's certainly like an oddity that we allow that kind of thing to happen in the first place. Anyway, that's my soapbox.
Yeah, well, so then I'm glad that I raised this PR just so we could explore this possibility. I mean, like I said, well, this is not a must-have kind of feature. So yeah, I mean, I guess we would just need to poll the sense of, I guess, the room/overall working group to figure out, which direction to move forward. I mean, on it. To me, meaning basically what I'm saying is I'm sort of indifferent to to how this particular small change is organized. I'm not sure I'll be able to find the time to work on. And I agree, like what Benji's writing in the comments, like schema include deprecated. Definitely agree with that need. Just reading Benji's comment, and I agree with that also. I'm not sure that obviously it could be broken down into different stages, adding the individual arguments. And I'm sort of, like it's sort of indifferent, but I might be able to tackle small pieces of it, bit by bit, if that's the direction that overall people want to go in. Yeah.
So
Cool.
Thinking about what you said, Lee, at first I was like, nah, we don't need to do that. We've reserved the entire double underscore namespace. It's fine. We can do what we want. But when you raise the second part, I'm like, oh, actually, yes, we need this. And we need this for a few reasons. One is deprecated, but with the semantic nullability, for backwards compatibility reasons, we effectively convert the type of something to a compatible type that the client can understand. So if the client hasn't said, hey, tell me about the semantic nullability of it, it's going to just tell you the traditional nullability. At the moment, we can do that with just one field because we only use semantic nullability on output field positions. But who knows what the future holds? Maybe we want to do it on input fields as well, or arguments or whatever. So specifying that in multiple places would be a pain. And also, if you specify it in your Dunder schema, when inside of a thing when you're querying that, but then you forget to do it in your Dunder type, that's kind of problematic. So yeah, it wants to be consistent throughout the entire tree, as you say. So actually, yeah, I am fully in support of this. I think it's a really good move, and then we can deprecate the Dunder type field.
Yeah. So anyway, Yakov started to just like toss a whole heap of complexity on top of your otherwise beautiful, simple, small change, which is a great proposal. But maybe a thing worth backing up for a second and looking at is, given all the iteration that we've seen over the last few years and the iteration that we expect to see in the year ahead, what is the next version of introspection look like, and how can we introduce that in an additive way? Which I think should include the ability to select a directive by name, which I 100% agree is a missing. It didn't really matter when you had kind of 2 or 3 directives ever, and now people have a lot of them. So getting them by name is quite useful for developer tooling.
Can I propose that Yakov's change can be as simple as just putting that new field onto Dunder schema? And we don't need to move Dunder type as part of the same work. We can do that as a separate pull request that we introduce later. Because essentially this is introducing a new piece of functionality, whereas the other change is moving some functionality. And yes, it'd be nice for consistency, but we don't need to hold up directive introspection in order to move this other thing.
In terms of sort of order of operations, definitely agree. But in terms of sort of the planning ahead, the one thing that I would want to make sure is like whatever proposed shape of the final schema everyone looks at, and we all say, yes, it will now take some work to dial in the spec and get that change rolled fully out. But we all agree on the same end state vision, because it certainly would be not great if we looked at that, weren't totally convinced, decided, this is more work than it was worth, let's back up. And then like, oh shit, actually we put Yakov's great suggestion inside there. And now we have this like terrible inconsistency for the rest of the time. So I would just want to at least make sure that beyond my off the cuff during a working group comment, we get to a point of confidence that that's where we'll end up. And then which case, like, yeah, totally. I agree that we can probably roll it out kind of block by block as we go. Similarly, like lifting include deprecated to the top could also be like in the same category of things that we want to introduce and moving introspection forward, but could be done in parallel with moving Dunder type name in. The last one that we might want to consider in this like category of the future of schema is a field on the schema object, which renders the SDL directly. So if the one thing you want from your introspection is a rendered version of SDL, that one is definitely a potentially spicy one, but it's certainly one that's been asked for a lot of how do I get a valid SDL from my server.
But which version
so
of the SDL are you outputting? I mean,
Oh,
which
boy.
parser needs to be able to process it? The one from
Yep.
3 years ago?
Great question. Okay, we'll pause there for future exploration. Thank you, Jakob, for tickling our brains and nerd sniping us into a broader topic. Yeah, I think you also have the floor for the rest of the meeting. I don't know if we'll have time for both of your topics, but I'll let you decide how you want to make the rest of the hour.
Yeah. I actually think the last topic is the most interesting. So in a devilish kind of way, I'm gonna not talk about it, and then maybe people will actually
Okay.
look at
Homework,
it.
click on the last
Whereas the
link and
less interesting topic, I want to make sure that I get people's feedback on, and that's this about errors being the question about whether how we should handle errors that are thrown by the asynchronous iterator or iterable that we have in GraphQL JS. Just to back up a little bit, for my own sake, I like to begin when I'm explaining from first principles, because otherwise I forget actually how everything works. So, we give partial responses, we send an error, all the errors for like in queries and mutations. We send, and when we are executing a subscription event, we give partial responses, and we put all the errors in this nice little errors field. And if those are field errors, and then we can have, I believe it's called a request error, right? When there's no data at all, and then we just have an errors key in the response. But we don't, the server doesn't throw an error. Even in that case, it sends in the request error, meaning it sends a nicely, a nice response to the client, the server application that is using GraphQL JS that then sends it using like the GraphQL over HTTP protocol or whatever protocol to the actual client. I think I'm using those terms slightly inaccurately, but I hope people get the idea. Now, what about in subscriptions? So in subscriptions, I think the way it was originally implemented was 100% identical when you're executing the subscription event. But I think the way in which we processed errors was slightly different when it came to actually obtaining the iterator. Now it's similar. So now the state of the reference implementation is if for some reason the server is unable to produce the iterator or the iterable, some error is encountered at that point, the GraphQL JS, when I say we, I mean GraphQL JS, will raise a request error, and maybe that was always the case, like if the schema was invalid. But now even if like an error is hit when we are running that subscription field to obtain the iterator, we also send a nicely formatted error that says that that we were unable to produce that iterator. But we still have an interesting idiosyncrasy that I think I have listed in the agenda. The question that we had on GraphQL JS: if there is an error produced when we try to use that asynchronous iterator to get a value, GraphQL JS now still just throws, as opposed to giving a nicely formatted error. And I don't think the spec says something specifically so much about how subscriptions should handle errors. I think it says that in terms of the execution subscription event, it says that it should be basically the same as executing a query or a mutation. But in terms of how to handle subscriptions themselves, it basically says something like you should return with an error or something like that. But it doesn't specifically say the form that error takes. And so the request we got is, it would be nice if you didn't throw. And obviously whoever's calling us could handle, if we do throw, could sort of like in JavaScript could catch that error, because this is happening before it's sent to the response. I mean, they're just using GraphQL JS and they could catch that. But we got this request, and I think it's a reasonable one. as long as, it would be a breaking change and we would communicate it within GraphQL JS. The only reason the only hesitation I have is because just the language that we have in our specification, it's sort of like, well, if the source stream, has an error, throws, if there's an error like iterating, then in the source stream, or I think the language is if the source stream completes with an error, then the response stream should complete with an error. And the question is whether I guess the question I have is whether those have to complete in exactly the same way. Like if the source stream throws in JavaScript, does that mean GraphQL JS like literally has to throw because we literally have to quote unquote complete with an error in the exact same way? Or if our users of GraphQL JS would find it beneficial to send like to not throw and send an error, is it okay if we do what they want? I think it's okay. Like I don't, and I think it's actually makes sense that the specification is agnostic about it. But this is all sort of my sense, and I'm not sure if it's too important of a topic or too unimportant of a topic. But I figure I'll raise it to everyone else to see if they have strong or weak opinions about it. And I promise the next topic is super exciting. Everyone should read about it.
I feel like GraphQL JS, like if you call GraphQL JS a method to execute, do the whole loop, it should only ever throw in the case where you would truly respond like a HTTP 500, which should not happen in the case of like your backend failed to produce a value or something like that. Like that's like in a similar way that if you query a field and that field blows up, the field resolver function throws or the backend fails or something, we don't throw an error. We don't throw from GraphQL JS. We grab that error. We have error handling logic, and we ensure that it is captured and returned back to the client. I think the same principle should apply here. And I appreciate that you pulled back up my editorial rewrite for event streams, which feels like this is maybe the last piece of that to codify before I go merge that, which I should have probably done a month or two ago. And I think that my rewrite there handled this case, but let me know if you think that it did not. And I'm happy to kind of take that back offline. I know you added a comment there that I need to go respond to. But the intent there is, if in the course of consuming that async iterable, the async iterable fails, that we would want to treat that similarly to how we would treat any other thing during the course of execution that fails, and grab the error and then go through like a GraphQL JS sanctioned error handling path, as opposed to throwing it and allowing that thrown thing to bubble all the way up through and then blow up whatever thing called GraphQL JS.
Okay. I think I'm getting also from you and from in the chat some positive messaging about how we should package this error, and that's what our users want. So I think that's good for me. I'm just clicking. Yeah, I'm just clicking what Benji put in the chat.
Yeah, just to share what I was posting into the chat. So the query and mutation algorithms say do a whole bunch of stuff. Let errors be the list of all field errors that were raised during this. I think subscribe doesn't have, and again, I'm just scanning over this very quickly. I don't think it doesn't have like an equivalent. Now, it wouldn't be the same because it's not a field error, it's a stream error, but it should, I think, capture if the stream completes with an error and should then say just return like the errors entry. I'm not sure, it's not clear to me whether it's not clear to me exactly what should happen with intermediate.
I think I see one section. I'm going to try to post a.
I think the intent, and my hope is that my rewrite captures this, and if it doesn't clearly, then I will account for it. The intent is for that map source to response event function that you see the subscription go through. that should be a response stream which is not capable of, or by spec should never end in failure. It's a response stream which exclusively yields either events or completes and not raise error. Because the source stream is possible to raise an error, but the source stream is passed into that map function. The map function accounts for error handle or error cases, right? Like if you go in there, you can see these whens. It's like when source stream completes with error, then currently it also passes. Oh yeah, you're right. Okay, it also passes through the top thing as an error. So yeah, right now we're passing it all the way through as an error. Oh boy, oh. Okay, so maybe this is a slightly more complicated thing to look at. If the desired intent is to actually have a emit a response which includes an events or an errors payload in that, GraphQL response, as opposed to the response stream itself erroring. Okay, this might be actually a more substantial change than Yakov, in which case we can figure out exactly what it means to do that. But the good news is I think everyone is aligned that this would be a valuable change to make.
Okay, and I think the spec as written doesn't prohibit that. Does change now? It's sort of agnostic, or would you say that we have to wait until the spec change to change it within the implementation? Like do it or in tandem, like as an actual spec change, or do you think we can move ahead with this request and then work on the spec later?
That's a good question. I do actually, the way the spec is written today is that if the source stream errors, then that error should be passed through. So whatever thing is calling GraphQL JS subscriptions does in fact get a broken response stream. In which case they can handle that broken response stream however they want. Presumably with a 500 HTTP 500 or something like that, or whatever mechanism they're using. But it makes sense to me that we would introduce a change. Which it might then technically be breaking, but hopefully kind of breaking in a positive way, or it is a behavioral change, which is GraphQL JS will begin to account for those errors itself, handling them and turning them into a GraphQL error shaped payload, after which it will close the response stream. That would be a behavioral change relative to what the spec says today. But I think probably one that would be deemed as a valuable one for the vast majority of consumers.
I want to go back on what I said before. I actually think that the current behavior is correct. I don't think that the GraphQL or the subscribe function itself should throw, which is what I thought was being said here, but it's not. What it's saying is that it's returning a stream successfully. That stream is yielding payloads, and then at the end it's yielding an error. And I think that that is correct. If a user doesn't want that to be the case, they already have the ability to solve that, I think, by wrapping the iterable that they return with something that captures that error and does something else with it. What does it mean for a client if the iterable actually exits with an error is kind of undefined. So it's, I think, really the server's decision of either, oh, we're going to catch this error and we're just going to terminate it cleanly, and that's it. That's all the data you get, but this is now the end of that subscription. You go figure it out. Or something went wrong, I don't know what to do with it. It would be nice, I think, to add like, an error payload to the end, maybe, but I think this is going to be a very, very significant breaking change if we do introduce this, because the subscriptions are very widely used. And we'd be introducing a new shape to the payload that people would be getting as part of the iterable result. Like it would literally be a different shaped object, right, that they would receive. I think I need to actually see, I need to write this all down as actual, like, here are the payloads that you would receive over the wire to make sense of it fully. But yeah, I would be very concerned about actually turning this into a like GraphQL error shaped payload that gets tucked on the end.
There
That's
are other
fine.
places where we do this shape, but Benji, I agree with you. There's this is something that could plausibly break existing clients, so we'd need to understand the shape of what that might look like. I don't know that it would be catastrophic to do that. It might actually end up being valuable to do it, but it might require coordination. Maybe it requires an opt-in flag. Not 100% sure. I think worthy of a follow-up discussion later.
Subscribe to keyword.
All right, folks, we're past the hour, and I'll use that to wrap us up. Thanks all for the detailed discussions and always moving the puck forward. Appreciate working with all of you. And I'll see all of y'all in GitHub in the intervening weeks, and then back here again next month.
Thanks, everyone.
You, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.